Well, I want to tell you a story about Jean and Danny. They were two brothers that were so excited because today was the day that they were going on a special picnic to Ottawa Park. Do you like picnics? Do you like to go on picnics? I do too. Yes, I do. Well, they were going to leave early because they had promised to help set up the picnic tables and to help light the fires in the barbecues. This was an annual picnic that their dad's work put on every year for them, and it was an exciting time. I've got the salad, Denny said. I've got the package of salad, and I've got the I've got the sandwiches, Jean said. They were going to leave early, so they got the things together, and they were going to walk to the park. Mom and Dad was to follow in the car afterwards, a little bit later, with a big, heavy thermos of lemonade. Peggy, they called their German Shepherd dog. Peggy, come on, girl, let's go. And Peggy ran down the hall, ready to go with them on their hike. And Peggy went everywhere with them. Denny gave Peggy a big, big hug and wrapped his arms around her and gave her a kiss. And she danced around. She gave him a lick. Peggy went everywhere with him. Why, they had Peggy for over 8 years, more than they could even remember. She was always by their side. Well, they went outside, and the park, it was a big, long park, and it was about, the edges of it was about a block away from their house. And they were going to walk through the park. It was a few miles long, and they were going to hike through the park to where the picnic grounds were, rather than walk along the highway. It would save them a few hours of time to get there. So they started on their journey, and can you imagine? They walked, and there was the park, and they had big, tall trees, and it was a beautiful sunny day as they walked, and Peggy was running beside them, just joyfully happy, wagging her tail. When they got to the picnic area, they saw that there were several families already there. And so they helped set up the tables, and then they went and they played ball. Well, after a while, some of the women called and said, "It's time to eat now, it's time to eat." And the boys thought, wow, where did the time go? And they looked around, and their father and mother weren't there. I wonder where they are, Jean said. And then suddenly, Mr. Saunders, their dad's supervisor, came up to them and said, "Boys, when we left home, we got a call from your mom and dad. They can't be here. Your grandmother has taken ill. And so I'm to take you home." Well, he saw the looks on the boy's face, and he said, "But don't worry, it's nothing real serious. She's going to be okay, boys. And remember, don't leave the park without me. You're to go home with me." And so the boy said, "Okay, thank you, Mr. Saunders." But they were very, very worried. This was their beloved grandmother, and she had been taken ill. Well, they looked at the tables and mounds of food, and they weren't very hungry, the boys weren't. And they tried to eat a little bit, but very, very worried about grandmother. Finally, the women began to pick up all the food and take their belongings and get ready to go home. And oh, the boys were relieved. They were anxious to get home to see what was going on. And so they called for Peggy, and they came up and they went over to where Mr. Saunders' new shiny car was. And Mr. Saunders came up to him and says, "Boys, I'm glad you're here. I see you're ready to go home." And then he looked and he said, "What's this? Is this your dog?" "Well, yes, Mr. Saunders, this is Peggy," Danny said proudly. And he looked angrily at his wife, and he looked over at his shiny new car with a spotless interior. And he said, He says, No, this'll never do. I can't have that dog in the car. She's going to have to stay here." "But Mr. Saunders," Danny said, "we can't leave her here. She has to come with us." "Did she walk across the park with you?" he said. Yes, she goes everywhere with us. Well, then she can find her way home. Come on, boys, let's get in the car. She can't come with you. Oh, Mr. Saunders, please, please, said the boys. And Mr. Saunders took Denny by the shoulders and prodded him into the car. And then he had Jean follow behind. He said, Mr. Saunders says, boys, she can follow along in the car. She can follow along in the car. And he slammed the door and got in and started up the engine. Oh, please, Mr. Saunders, don't leave her here. She can't find her way home. And Mrs. Saunders said, boys, you know, she can go across the park. Well, she'll probably even be home before you get there. She'll be all right. Oh, please, Mr. Saunders. And then he sped away. Meanwhile, and then Jean, just before he took off, Jean looked out the window and she said, Peggy, Peggy, go home, Peggy. And Denny said, Jean, we hadn't taught her anything about that. She doesn't know how to go home. And the car sped away. And the boys, they looked out behind the car. They kept looking to see if Peggy was going to follow along. And they didn't see any dog. And they were so worried that she might get run over by a car if she did. Well, finally, Mr. Saunders pulled into their driveway and let the boys out. Thank you, Mr. Saunders, for the ride, Denny said, even though he tried to be grateful, but he sure didn't feel very grateful. Mother and Father hadn't come home. The house was dark, so the boys sat on the porch. And they looked, and Denny says, Jean, do you think maybe Peggy tried to follow us home and got run over by a car? Oh, I don't think so. I don't know, Jean said. I'll tell you what, let's go over to the edge of the park and let's call for her. So they went down the block to where the park began, and they called her, Peggy, here, girl, come on, Peggy, come home. And they called and they called and they waited. No dog, no dog. Oh, sadly and dejected, they walked back to the house. The house was still dark and Father and Mother hadn't come home. So they went in the house and they went upstairs and they decided they better get ready for bed. Well, as they lay on the bed, Jean could hear that Denny was tossing and turning and tossing and turning. And Jean said, don't worry, we'll go early in the morning and we'll go look for her. And Denny says, but do you suppose she might have gotten run over by a car? Do you think she's going to be all right? Let's pray, Jean says, and we'll ask Jesus to watch over her. And we'll pray for Grandma too. Well, finally, about 4 a.m, Jean heard the cuckoo clock strike, and he decided to get up even though it was still kind of dark, and he very quietly got dressed. Well, Denny woke up and heard him, and Denny says, are you getting dressed? Are you going to go now? I want to go with you. And he jumped up and he put his clothes on, and the boys went down the stairs, and just as they got down the stairs, they saw a car coming up the driveway with the lights on. Mom and Dad's home, they said, and they ran outside. Well, Dad parked the car by the porch, and he got out, and he said, boys, what are you doing up so early? And he says, and they said, how's Grandma? Is she doing okay? And he said, don't worry, boys, she had a slight stroke, but she's doing so much better, and Mom decided to stay another day with her. I decided to come home and see how you boys were doing and to get ready for work. And Danny said, Dad, we lost Peggy, and he couldn't say anything more. And Jean had to tell Dad the rest of the story, what happened to Peggy. And Dad said right away, come on, boys, jump in the car, and we're going to drive down to the park. The way Mr. Saunders come in, we'll look for her and see where she's at. So he drove down the road, and as they drove towards the park, they looked and they looked outside to see if there was any mangled dog along the side of the road, and they didn't see anything. And soon Dad was into the entrance of the park, and they went into the circular driveway, and they drove around to where the picnic tables were. And there by the ovens Where they left Peggy, there she sat, looking up expectantly, just waiting for her family to come and get her. And they, they were so excited, and the boys jumped out of the car. Can you just imagine as they ran over and grabbed their dog, and she licked them all over the face, jumped up in their arms and wagged her tail, and what a reunion. There she sat, and all Father could say, what trust, what loyalty. She didn't move at all. She sat there just trusting, knowing that her family was going to come and get her. And so Jean put her in the car, and her fur was so wet from the night dew, and he took off his jacket, and he rubbed her down, and Dad didn't say a word about a wet dog being in the car. Well, as they drove home, and he looked in the rearview mirror, and he saw the happy boys and the happy dog, Jean said, Dad, you know, I prayed for Grandma that she would be all right, and I also prayed for Peggy. Is it all right for me to pray to God about a dog? And Dad said, yes. God knows how much Peggy loves you and how she's watched over and taken care of her all your life. And she knows how much God knows how much you love your dog and how you take good care of her. Yes, he answers prayer. And Danny says, I think that my prayers help us find Peggy, don't you, Dad? And he says, yes, very much so. Well, the boys got out of the car, and as Dad turned around and looked, Peggy jumped up on the back seat there and gave Dad a grateful lick in the face. So happy for him to be there. And Dad says, boys, I want you to remember this. I want you to always remember to be faithful and trusting in God and know that he hears your prayers. You can always come to God for any little thing. And today we saw a different kind of faith, didn't we, and trust in your dog, how he trusted you and knew that you were going to be right there for him. And he stayed right where he was, knowing that you were going to come for him. What trust. And I want you to always remember that. Okay, go back to your seats.